Thank you for joining us today for our May webinar presentation, The Play Principle, Games, Theater Exercises, and the Empowerment Part of Empowerment Self-Defense. Presenting for us today is the Professor of World Arts and Cultures and Dance at UCLA, martial artist, author, and ESD Global 2017 Instructor Training Program alumni, Professor Jay O'Shea.
Good morning, or good afternoon to some of you, I guess. As the title implies, this talk, or this session really, is about games and the relationship between games and empowerment. I obviously did not come up with the idea of incorporating games into ESD training. In fact, it's something I've gotten from other ESD practitioners. So in true ESD fashion, I'm not coming to you as an expert who's going to tell you what you should be doing. I'm framing what you most likely already are doing in a particular way in the hopes that it might shed light on your practice and hopefully generate some new insights. So I'm going to put forward a few ideas about why play matters. And I'm going to draw on some research I've done into games and play. And I'm going to frame that up in terms of how we can use games in ESD and why it's important that we do so. So just to start with where I often start in my writing, which is with an anecdote, or actually in this case, two anecdotes. A couple months ago, I was at the AMI training, the Association of Women Martial Arts Instructors conference. And I was in a conversation with a couple of martial artists and self-defense instructors who I respect a great deal. And I was talking about the training I had done at ESD Global, and specifically with UD, and I was talking about games and play. And one of the people I was talking to said, oh, I see, this is for kids. And I was really taken aback by this. And in fact, I was troubled by it as well, because there's a common assumption that games and play are for children, and that adults need to jettison play at a certain point in their lives, and that it's sort of appropriate that they do so. This is an idea that's common in a lot of societies now, and it's also something that I've challenged really directly in my book, Risk, Failure, Play, where I spent many pages and I spent a lot of words and indeed many years working on this idea of like, what is the importance of play for adults, and why is it absolutely crucial that our societies make a space for play for adults. So I was kind of left a little bit puzzled by this idea that play in self-defense training was for children. Later, I did a training with, as part of the UCLA Prison Education Project, and this is a really wonderful initiative where some of my colleagues are creating courses for incarcerated youth and women that they can take alongside UCLA students for UCLA credit. I joined this training because I was hoping to do some ESD training for incarcerated youth and women, and I taught a couple of ESD exercises. So for the Prison Education Project participants, they were not surprised at all by the use of games. And in fact, some of the other presenters were incorporating games too. And when I discussed this with them, we talked a lot about the commonalities, like, oh, okay, we do a game or an exercise and it's kind of open-ended, and that afterwards we do a bit of a debrief. And what I found out is that they are working within the theater of the oppressed modalities. To sum it up very briefly, the theater of the oppressed is a system of designing performance in order to create social critique, generate social justice, have some kind of political intervention. And it has a lot to do with unsettling hierarchies between the actor, director, writer, and breaking down boundaries between performers and spectators. So their games were completely, completely expected and indeed encouraged. So this led me to think about a few things that I think might be relevant for empowerment self-defense training. So the fact that we see games appear in ESD and we see it appear in theater of the oppressed suggests to me that there's something about games themselves that when handled with attention and care that they can be empowering. And I think a number of us have had this experience. I'd be interested to hear in the discussion at the end if you have, but like this experience where people come into your class, they come into an ESD class and they're hesitant and they're nervous. And then they walk out kind of buoyant and confident and joyous. And I think that has a lot to do with a number of factors in ESD. The conscious structure that puts personal agency front and center, personal decision-making, that we avoid victim blaming, all of that. But I also think it has something to do with the fact that ESD uses a lot of games. So I'm kind of putting forward an observation, an interpretation, and a theory, which is that I've seen games show up in trainings that are meant to be empowering. And I've seen this in different kinds of contexts. From that, I'm interpreting the idea that there's something about the structure of games that puts forward and encourages personal power, individual decision-making. And from that, I'm also proposing a theory that games are what separates ESD from more hierarchical forms of self-defense. So just to briefly comment on that last idea, hierarchical self-defense, I think this is something that many of us have encountered. It's also often, we find this kind of self-defense training linked to martial arts academies. It's often linked to like institutional structures like police or public safety trainings, that kind of thing. And in hierarchical self-defense, there's a right or wrong way of doing something. And the instructor is the expert who's going to tell you what you need to be afraid of and how you need to respond. And what I found with hierarchical self-defense is that there are drills, but there aren't a lot of games. Or if there is a game, it's a game where it's like, there's one right answer and you have to actually figure it out. And it's almost like a guess what the instructor is thinking kind of thing. And so I think, with drills, I think the distinction between a drill and a game really comes down to the fact that in a drill, there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. Sometimes drills encourage experimentation, but most of them, it's about mastering a skill. Now, of course, we do that in ESD as well. Of course, in ESD, we sometimes need to teach people the proper way to do something, like the safest, the most effective way of, say, landing a palm strike or getting to the ground, that kind of thing. But a lot of our trainings are also a little bit more open-ended. They're a little more exploratory. They're a little more creative. So I want to get just briefly into some of the theory around games to try to highlight what it is about them that can be empowering. So these are what play theorists talk about as the attributes of games. So when we say that games are intrinsically valuable, we mean that play exists for its own purpose. It doesn't do anything in the outside world. It's not done for an external reason. If it's done for an external reason, like money, prestige, acknowledgement, then it's typically considered work and not play. So at first glance, when we're talking about this in relation to self-defense, that makes no sense at all, right? Because we train in and we practice self-defense for a reason, a specific reason that has real meaning in the outside world. Like we do it to protect ourselves. In a real life situation, if an action like a kick, a strike, a raised voice isn't necessary, then that action is no longer self-defense, it's actually violence. And like the definition of self-defense is that it has to be an action taken in the face of the imminent threat of serious harm, is usually like the legal terminology that's used. But given all that, I still think there's a place in self-defense training for the idea of self-defense as intrinsically valuable. In other words, like we often talk about it as, you may never have to use these skills, right? Hopefully you won't. Hopefully your boundary setting is going to be enough. But it's still worthwhile to have them and to practice them. And I think this is important both because it's true. Like we all know that like if we can defend ourselves physically, we're better able to take care of ourselves emotionally, and we're better able to set our boundaries verbally in our day-to-day lives. But I think it's also important that we think about the idea of self-defense as being enjoyable in its own right, because when we think about self-defense as necessary, that's when we start to get into this tired but reoccurring idea of self-defense as victim blaming, because there's that idea that it's conscripted, that people, specifically women, are forced to learn self-defense. And we get this idea that self-defense can't really change society. It can only be a sort of stopgap solution. So that's why I'm kind of emphasizing this idea of games or play and self-defense as worthwhile in itself. And I think play can actually be a way of reversing some of these assumptions without countering them directly. Just giving somebody an opportunity to, like, hey, let's do a self-defense class and see what you think of it. And setting it up in a way that is valuable and enjoyable, it kind of gets across this idea that, hey, maybe this is not just about something you're being forced to do. Okay, so moving on to the next attribute of games that I think is important. Play puts us in something that social psychologists call the flow state. This is a state of complete immersion in the activity at hand. It's where, like, time seems to melt away. It slows down or speeds up. It's where our focus is completely on the task at hand or the activity. We lose a sense of self-consciousness. We're no longer worried, like, am I doing this well enough? Or am I being effective? Or what do people think of me? And instead, we have this enhanced sense of self-awareness. Psychologists have gone so far as to say that the flow state and experiencing the flow state is what makes life worth living. So it's a pretty powerful thing, this ability to step into the flow state. I want to suggest that when we give ESD participants an opportunity to play well-designed games, we're giving them a chance to experience the flow state. And that's a pretty powerful thing. That's a pretty amazing opportunity. The next kind of attribute is really related to the previous one. So it's kind of almost a sub-theme, but the flow state is when we're balanced between, the flow state appears between boredom and anxiety. I'm taking this from the social psychologist with the amazing name of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And he's written about flow and the autotelic state and, like, a kind of optimization of life, really. But he talks about basically the flow state appears when our skills and the task are ideally matched to each other. And that's kind of, on one side, we have boredom where our skills are greater than the task. And then we have anxiety where the task outpaces our skills. And the flow state kind of sits between them. And I think this is important for two reasons. One is that when we're in the sweet spot between boredom and anxiety, we experience a sense of mastery. We feel like we're accomplishing something. And that's super important when we're talking about people's boundaries being violated, when we're training people who've had their boundaries violated. And of course, everyone in our class has, because everyone's boundaries have been violated at some point. It's super important to give people the opportunity to experience mastery. And that's where I think ESD is so different from hierarchical self-defense, because hierarchical self-defense kind of does this, I'm going to break you down to build you back up again, which is not super helpful for people who've already had their boundaries violated. I think this is also important because arguably modern societies leave us in situations where often we are either bored or anxious. When I think about, like, a typical work situation is often we're either bored or we're anxious. Even things like commuting, getting to that work situation, very often there's either boredom in the process or we're anxious because we're needing to accomplish something that can't be accomplished in the time that we have. And so, and a lot of education is the same way. A lot of school situations are set up to, like, basically move us between boredom and anxiety and not have us very often end up in the sweet spot of the flow state. So I think whenever we provide people opportunities for being in the flow state, we're doing something potentially useful for them and it's potentially empowering. So the last point is that games encourage creativity and experimentation. So games often present us with an obstacle to be overcome. That is like typically one of the definitions of a game. And the game becomes how you overcome the obstacle. Some games have a single solution, but most of them, there's creativity. You can find multiple solutions to the problem. Okay, so that's sort of game theory and why I think games are important, why we can make the argument that games are related to empowerment. I want to talk a little bit now about the format and structure of ESD games. And kind of move away from the theory and talk about like actual games that we might play in our trainings. So I put together a list of questions. When we move on to the discussion, you can kind of weigh in and tell me or tell each other if you think we should add criteria to this list. But here's how I'm thinking about how ESD games might relate to game theory and how they can better cultivate empowerment. So the first thing, of course, is do they teach a valuable self-defense skill? Because obviously self-defense, I can say as much as I want that it's intrinsically valuable and it's about being immersed in the moment, but really I do want my students to come away from that having good self-defense skills. So I would say the very first criteria is like, does it actually teach a valuable skill? But then I think the important thing is with an ESD game is, does it lead the student towards the skill rather than mandating it? Like, is this something that we're allowing the students to discover themselves rather than telling them, this is what the skill is and you have to get it right? Part of that is, does the game offer a logical progression, which in a sense can minimize both anxiety and boredom because we move through the process step by step. The next question is then, is it intrinsically valuable, which is a kind of fancy way of saying, is it actually fun to do the game? Because if it's not fun, then it's really not much of a game. And then does the game encourage creativity, reflection, experimentation? So I'm gonna address this in a couple of ways. I was going to give you an example that I use in my teaching, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to describe a game that you use in your teaching. And then we can talk about how the game lines up with these criteria. And if you want, you can also then add things to my list of questions. So here's my example. I learned a distance game from UD when I did the ESD boot camp. You've probably learned this one as well. I call it the Hut Go game because it's the game where you have two people, or you have your group break into pairs. And so you have two people and they're both walking in the same direction. And the facilitator says hut, and both people say go, and they turn and they walk. And then they say, and then the facilitator says hut again, and they change directions again and they walk. And they do this for a little while. Does this sound familiar? Is this something that other people learned as a game? No? Okay, great. So I'll continue with the description of it, and then you can tell me if it does start to sound familiar, and if it doesn't, that's great, because if I describe it clearly enough, then you can use it in your teaching. Okay, so that's step one, right? And it almost has this thing, this is why I'm talking about theater exercises, because it almost seems like a theater or choreography exercise, because you have a group of, say, 10 people in 5 pairs, and they're just walking around through the space and they're changing direction. The next step is you have the same partners, they're in pairs, and they're walking around the space, and the facilitator says, hut, and the two of them turn towards each other, they high-five each other, and they say, go, and then they continue walking in a different direction. And then the facilitator says, hut, and they turn toward each other, they high-five, and they say, go, and then they walk in a different direction. So each time it's a different person who's in front, right? It keeps changing who's in front. So the person who's in front is the one who turns around and they high five each other and they say go. So then it's like, okay, that's step 2. And then this too feels a little bit like a theater exercise, because they're just kind of interacting with each other, and they're, they're high fiving and they're laughing and they're calling this out. And then the third version is you have the group, you have people get into pairs again, and they start walking. And then when the facilitator says hut, the first person in front turns around, gets their hands up and says no. And then they start walking in the other direction. So the person who was behind is now in front, and the facilitator says hut. The person in front turns around, gets their hands up and says no. And so both people get a chance to do that as they move through the space. So those are the 3 progressions of the game. So it goes from something that seems very innocent, like it's a little choreography exercise, to then moving to here's a response if somebody is following you or you think somebody is following you. So it moves from the completely playful to the completely serious. And it does it in a pretty swift manner. And it's really only at that point when the students, or at least when I've taught it, the students, I teach the third version and they say, are we still high-fiving each other in this one? And I say no. And then they realize like, oh, I see what's going on. So they have that moment of like, okay, now we're actually, I thought we were just messing around, but now we're actually learning a self-defense skill. And we're learning it for something that is a potentially very scary situation. Like what happens if you're walking and someone comes up behind you very quickly, and you think they're approaching to attack you or harm you, and you have to turn and create distance and set a boundary. So to check in again, is this something that people have used in their teaching or have encountered before, or is it still unfamiliar?
I've used it in my teaching, Jay.
Okay, right, and because we did the same iteration of boot camp. Yeah, okay. And other people, it's one they haven't encountered before?
I don't know, because I wasn't in the actual classes last summer to see what games they went over, but I think in the manual, Udit has it listed under the title Follow Me.
Oh, okay.
And there's a written description of it there. So for all of you who have the teaching manual that we've received at the training, that's where you'll find a written description of it.
Oh, great. Okay. I didn't know that. I didn't actually cross-reference it with the manual. I should do that. So what's been really nice for me when I teach that is most of the participants, it's fun and they're laughing. And then there's a thing where afterwards I say like, okay, so what am I teaching you here? And they go like, oh, okay. This is like if I'm being followed, I need to create distance. So I think, and I would compare that. I selected this example particularly because I think it compares or contrasts so neatly with what happens in hierarchical self-defense classes, where I've seen like an instructor kind of say, where somebody says, what if somebody comes up behind you? And the instructor just says, you should never let them get that close. And, I'm kind of exaggerating it a little bit because I'm, wanting to highlight this difference, but I have heard that, multiple times in non-ESD self-defense trainings of, you should never let someone get that close. You shouldn't have, or you should have better awareness, right? And I think if you just tell somebody something or mandate something, we see there's a lot of evidence for that. Like they're not going to take it in the same way if they actually get to experience it. But it's particularly helpful if they get to experience it in a way that they seem to have come to the insight themselves. So I selected this example also because I think it does sort of highlight these criteria. So I think it clearly teaches a valuable self-defense skill, right? That like, here's how to create distance. Here's how to set a boundary if somebody's coming up on you too fast. Having the 3 iterations, having the 3 versions leads the student toward the skill. So instead of saying like, when you're in a situation where somebody's coming up on behind you, this is what you need to do, the student gets to discover that themselves. And there is a logical progression there. I'm not just like launching them headlong into like, okay, somebody's going to come up behind you really fast. It's going to be really scary. And then you need to turn and face them. But instead it's like a gradual, logical development of, hey, you're just changing direction. Hey, you're just high-fiving each other. So that kind of situates it in between anxiety and boredom, and ideally gets us into the flow state. I would say it's intrinsically valuable because I think it's fun. We can't, of course, always speak for our students and say that they're going to find the same things fun that we do. But that is something that, you know, one can just read the room and see if people are laughing and smiling and participating actively and that kind of thing. And then I would say that this exercise also does encourage a degree of reflection. It's not necessarily built around creativity and experimentation, because the only option you're giving the participants is which direction to change, which direction to walk. So they're moving around the space in all kinds of interesting ways. So that does give them a little room for creativity, but it mostly gives them room for reflection, I would say. So now I want to turn over to you for two things. One is, would you add anything to this set of questions in terms of attributes of ESD games? Like, do you think there's anything about ESD games, qualities that an ESD game needs to have that should be on this list that I've provided?
I had something. I've been thinking a lot for the last several years about the things we learn with our bodies that we don't even know we learn. And I mean, we don't know intellectually. Our bodies know them, we don't know them intellectually. And that's both bad things like holding ourselves back, as well as how to move in the world. And so it would seem to me that is this, a question might be, is this something people will integrate into their bodies, might be something that would be valuable as part of games.
Right, and I think, yes, it does make sense, absolutely. So I think there's a thing about like, if we experience something, we take it in a lot more swiftly than if we try to learn it just intellectually, or if we're told we should be doing something, you know. If we get a chance to practice it, to fully experience it. So I would say that there is something there, kind of almost under that category of, does it lead the student towards the skill? Like, is that an embodied process? You know, is that a physical process? As opposed to just a kind of like, I'm going to work it out in my head kind of thing. Yeah.
That's as close as I've got.
Great. So is there anything? Yeah, Antonella, do you want to?
Yeah, so in my experience so far, I've noticed that I need to embody the childlike personality within myself first to nearly break down that seriousness, that barrier, and become really silly and just have fun with it. And I guess it gives permission to everybody else. Oh, okay, I can just relax and have fun and enjoy this game instead of it being, you know, so serious and so professional, I guess. So I think as an instructor, it's like really to get into that mindset of, you know, sometimes you in yourself need to get out of that comfort zone and just be really silly and roll around and look like, you know, a bit of a clown to be, you know, that role model for the young kids or the adults to go, oh, it's okay to be silly. We don't have to always be so serious.
Yes. You know, it's interesting that it's interesting you say that about being like a clown, because I don't know that much about Theater of the Oppressed. It's just something that like I happened to encounter, and I was like, wow, this sounds a lot like ESD. But they actually talk about the role of the facilitator is the joker or the prankster. And so that's actually like the job of the facilitator is to be playful. And I think you're right that part of it is like to figure out how to embody that right away. Even though, of course, when we walk into any kind of training situation and we're the trainer, like we have to kind of manage the room too and be like, yes, this is a performance. Here I am. Pay attention to me, listen to my instructions. But then at the same time doing that, like, but it's okay to play. So do you have strategies for that?
Well, I guess I think it's quite a personal journey. So for me personally, I'm naturally the serious one, always the responsible one, the one that everyone comes to, if they need the support. So I really, before I get into that role as an ESD instructor, I really need to check in with myself and make sure that I leave any of my issues outside the door, or any, stresses of daily life and things like that, and just be completely present. It's like you say, you're in that flow state playing that particular role. And I think you just need to, access a different part of your brain to be able to let go of your own inhibitions. And for me, that's actually a huge thing, but it's not about me right now. So yeah, I really just need to, be present, and I've got to show up and present for the others. And it's quite challenging for myself because I don't go to that place often unless I'm an instructor. So, but what I find after I finish the class is I'm exhausted. Like I just need to tune out and stay away from everyone. Don't talk to anybody, because, you do have to access a higher part of yourself that you don't normally every day. So yeah, I think for me, it's just a journey of nearly a ritual of getting to, okay, I'm here, getting out of my comfort zone, and also verbalizing it. And again, like the word permission, giving the others permission that it's okay to have fun in here. It's like comedy, such a serious topic of self-defense. We're doing exactly the same thing as comedians do. We're just breaking down the seriousness of the topics by making fun of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a commonality there, that just like humor is often about things that's not funny, and about things that are actually extremely serious. So too, like games are often structured around things that are really not playful at all. Like so many times games are really structured forms of conflict. So it kind of fits really perfectly with the ESD model. Absolutely. So what I'd like to do now is turn over to you to see if anyone wants to volunteer with a description of a game that they use in ESD training, in ESD teaching, and then we can see how it fits with these attributes and how it fits with what I presented about games and how they might be empowering.
It looks like Anne has a suggestion, but she's muted.
Yeah, there we go.
There she is.
Hi. So I never really thought of this as a game. I guess part of me listening to what you're talking about is almost reframing some of the things I do in terms of, oh, this has like some game-like qualities. And then the other thing that I'm thinking about as I'm listening to this webinar is not rushing people through the laughter to get to the seriousness. So because I'll share like sort of, this is like a tried and true exercise, which I'm now thinking of as a game because I can see the fun that people have of it. And I see all of these other attributes that you're talking about. And I'm also aware of the messaging that I and other teachers give to possibly rush people through, because part of the point of the game is to get to a point where your voice is in conjunction with your body language, and we want to eliminate all the smiling and blah, blah, blah. So part of what I'm thinking as I'm listening to this is like how to like marry the two, like let people have the fun and get to the point through that progression where they're building the skill of being in congruence. If we want to teach them a self-defense skill. So absolutely. Does that make sense? Like
yes, completely. Yeah.
Yes. So this is these are stop lines. I'm sure most people have seen these in one form or another, where you have people in lines apart from one another across a room, and you teach people to kind of one side is, you know, approaching, the other side is learning how to do set a boundary. And the way I teach it is to, you know, teach them to like sort of get into that, you know, get in touch with gravity, kind of settle a little bit, put your hands up, use your voice, and intensify if the person doesn't respond to your no. And so we usually go through like 3 iterations, and then finally the person stops. So they're disregarding, you know, your stop the first time, the second time. And so the person is learning how to intensify their body language, intensify their voice. But what inevitably happens is they're laughing, like for the first part of it. And then I'll also take it apart and say, okay, this time you can only use your body language. And this time you can only use your voice. And this time you can only use your facial expression, which is incredibly challenging, except for like teachers and mothers, you know, get that face on to try and stop the person. So we do have a lot of fun with it. But if one of the points is also to get people to, you know, be consistent, send out, you know, their facial expression, their body language, their voice, to raise, you know, to raise the volume but not the pitch, to not end on a rising intonation, all of those types of things that we start to like discover. So I guess what I'm wrestling with is, not trying to shut off the playfulness too soon.
Yeah,
So.
that's super interesting. I think I have a couple of thoughts about it, and I'd like to kind of bounce it back to you because I know you have so much experience with teaching this.
Yeah.
But for me, I think that's where the theater part of it comes in, right?
Oh, okay.
It's like kind of recognizing that like we can experiment with this and we can play and we can have a lot of fun, but then there's a point at which you're in a role,
Right?
And you don't want to break frame when you're in the role.
Right.
So,
Right.
and even if we're doing experimental theater or theater of the oppressed or, you know, any of that, when to inhabit a role, we have to actually make sure our facial expressions, our dialogue, and our body all line up, you know? So that can be a kind of fun way to work with it. And to have that like both in the drill and then carrying that forward, you know, to real life situations. And when we talk about all those things about like how an aggressor will, you know, manipulate and all of that kind of stuff, is recognizing, you know, other people are playing roles in real life. Ideally with people we care about, we want to be as authentic as possible, but you know, with people we don't know or people who we do know who are trying to manipulate us, we have the right to act theatrically in a way, you know, to play a role.
So that's good. So I haven't been doing anything wrong in like getting people to take it seriously after a while.
No, right. And I think that's what we want to lead it to. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right.
That's good.
And I think within that drill, I think there's something interesting too, where there's the sincere laughter of discovery, right? Where you do the stop thing and there's a moment like, okay, the person's going to run towards you really fast and people are like, they're laughing. And like, there's this real like, almost hilarity about it.
Yeah.
And to me, that's interesting because that's a point of discovery. Where they're like, that is really hard when somebody's behaving really erratically or they're coming at me really fast. Like, whoa.
Yeah.
And like, for me, that encouraging that laughter is okay, or not okay, but like desirable. Whereas I think there's the thing where people go like, right, and they're like laughing because that's almost an insincere laughter where it's like, I'm doing this because I'm not comfortable setting the boundary. I've never given myself permission, so I'm undercutting it. And so I think that's the thing too, like of trying to encourage people to differentiate maybe. Yeah,
and that usually happens because we're not used to setting boundaries or using our voices. And then like when we debrief it, we'll also we'll take apart those elements and then put it back together. And when people are allowed to use their body language and their voice and their facial expression, again, it's all stronger because you've kind of like pulled it apart and put it back together. The other thing that we'll debrief is like, how did it feel to like disregard somebody's boundary, which is also very uncomfortable. And like, so then you can kind of get a little bit of a peer into the mind, perhaps, of a perpetrator who's not really taking you into consideration. So there's a lot of different ways you can kind of learn from it, just from how you feel in your body. Like, ooh, she said no, and I kept going, and that didn't feel so good. To like disregard somebody's, desire for personal space, or this felt uncomfortable, so there's a lot of places to go with it. But yeah, I was curious between the boundary of like fun and seriousness, but I think there is such a fun element that people do start. One thing I also have to do is tell mothers and daughters to stop correcting each other.
Okay.
If I have mothers and daughters in classes, they all want to tell them, "You're doing it wrong, Mom. You're doing it," or the vice versa. To just like let people get to that play thing where their mother isn't just saying, like, you're not drying the dishes right, you're not.
Right.
So, yeah, so it's got a lot of like interesting pieces when you're dealing with family members or pairs, and so it's good. But I hadn't really thought of it as a game until hearing you describe like the attributes of a game. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting idea to differentiate between a game, like play/game, theater exercise, and laughter. Because like laughter can work in so many different ways, and I think the trick as a self-defense instructor is really to find like where is this like the authentic, joyful laughter, and where is it nervous laughter. And if somebody is experiencing nervous laughter, recognizing, okay, that's okay in this situation, but ideally when you as we practice using those skills, how do we get away from that nervous laughter?
Right.
And I love what your suggestion is of like, well, you break it down into its components.
Thank you. Yeah. I think I have to give credit probably to Nadia Telsey. She has a 4-page booklet on how to teach verbal skills, which of course we know also involves our bodies. So you can't really, there's not a total break from that. And this is, one of her classics that she probably got from other people is the stop lines with variations, basically. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that fits in with the thing about experimentation. I think like breaking something down to its components. So
Good.
That's really interesting too.
The facial part is the hard. I found is the most challenging for people to set a boundary with just their face, facial expression. Really, really difficult. And some people can do it really well, and most of us can't at first. So it's really, just to convey that message without words is fun.
Yeah, definitely. And I think then that also has to do with that thing about experimentation and creativity. Like, okay, so I actually don't really, this person who's standing across from me, I actually have no vested interest in making them stop moving toward me. But let's imagine that I do, and let's imagine that I have to then take away all the other things that I would use. So it does have that like experimental structure too.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the feedback.
We have a little bit of time left. So does anyone else want to volunteer with an example, or do we want to move to just questions and comments?
I have an example, and I think Antonella has used this a lot too, at least judging by our Facebook page, and that's the battles with pool noodles that we did.
Oh yeah.
Where you use a, and I have to say, when I first saw that at camp, coming as a martial artist, and like, oh, this is kind of ridiculous. But when I enjoyed it when I played it, and when I have done it in a group, what I found is that everybody's laughing and everybody's trying to hit each other because they know they're not really going to hurt each other. And so they feel free to do it. And then they're just loosened up for the whole thing. And Adela might have some other comments on that, but I just find that to be a really useful way of starting things off. And I wonder what other people might think of that.
Okay, so a question from Matt is, what is the pool noodle exercise? So Nancy or Antonella, do you want to describe that, or do you want me to try describing it?
I'll try real quick. It's basically you take a pool noodle cut to about a length of 2 feet, roughly. So it's, it's maybe that big around. You can see my hands, maybe a couple inches around. And you fight with it like you might fight with a stick. I tell people to avoid the face because you don't want to poke somebody in the eye even with a pool noodle. but you try to hit each other, and you try to block and hit the other person, just like you might be if you were sparring with a bosun or a staff, or in the various arts where you use a little bit of weapon. And because it's foam and you really can't hurt anybody, people loosen up. And I think my thought with this is something that's particularly good for women who didn't do this as kids, and people who haven't done martial arts. Am I explained it enough?
Yeah, I think so. And then I think just one thing I might add to it is that the idea is often to guide the participants towards the insight where they realize that actually you're safer, it's a distance and a range game. Right. So realizing like you're safe when you're outside the range of the noodle, but you're actually safest when you crash in and get inside. So it teaches people about landing a strike, and how to land, like say, for example, a palm strike, you got to get in there and get pretty close. And you're actually, once you're in close, you are reasonably protected, with some important caveats, but that you're actually safer than you would be if you were just like right outside the range of the pool noodle. And it's a really fun way of like getting to that conclusion instead of just telling somebody like, I'm going to swing this at you and I want you to crash in. Oh.
I have another angle with that game, and that is it breaks down the psychophysical element that women generally don't go hitting unless, you may have, growing up, if you've had brothers, and maybe part of rough and tumble play, which is really healthy because it does also instill boundaries when you play those games, like animals, and when they're puppies and baby animals, that they learn that kind of play in nature. So if you haven't grown up with brothers or had that rough and tumble play, you don't understand what it's like to be hit or to hit, and you're not, and it's okay to in that parameter to play like that. So what I also add is that it breaks down that barrier of being hit and hitting. So we're in a safe place, it's fun, and then, I'm the one that will initiate, and I will go and approach someone that I generally would know or made a bit more contact with before the class. And then I make a point of bringing the pool noodle behind me to make sure that it's like for real effect of like, bang, I'm going to bring it down, and you can see everyone going, oh my God, we're going to be doing that. And once I make the contact with the person, you hear that audio, the audio impact's quite strong. So then everyone's still like, oh, what the hell? But the person then I said, did that hurt? And the person's like, no. And then I actually turn on the music really loud. And then then it's like, okay, everyone start hitting. And then, they still may be standing there going, I don't know if I can do this. So I then start hitting everyone else. And it's like, oh, far out. Well, if you're hitting me, I'm hitting you back. And then everyone starts getting into it. And it's really interesting to see the psychology of it, that as soon as somebody gets hit, it's like, fuck you, like I'm going to start hitting back. And before you know it, it's really hard to get them back in the room and calm down. But that's a huge icebreaker. And after that, again, with that childlike play, it just creates that openness of, if I was already in that point of like, no way, I can't hit, anybody. And then they just proved it to themselves that they can. It just opens up to so much more learnings in the rest of the class. So that's Nancy, that's a huge one. And we loved playing that, and I love teaching it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example of where, it is intrinsically valuable, right? It's fun. Like everybody has a great time. They're laughing. They're like, there's like this buoyancy in the room when people do that game. And it serves this function of being, as you say, an icebreaker. And then at the same time, it is teaching valuable self-defense skills about range and distance. And it is teaching you like, yes, you can hit, and yes, you can actually be hit and survive it and be fine. And then there is sort of a potential well, there is quite a bit of room for experimentation, right? Like for creativity and exploration of like, as people are moving around and they are hitting each other with pool noodles of like, you know, and they are trying to block and realizing like, oh, if I step in, this happens, you know, if I get really out of the way, this other thing happens. So it really does have a lot of that like personal decision-making and experimentation within it as well. So at this point, should we then move to questions, comments? I think we have a few things in the chat section. So unless anyone else has another game that they want to share. No? Okay, so we'll move to the
All I'm seeing in the chat in terms of questions right now is the questions that Matt had about the pool noodles.
Okay.
So yeah, if anybody has any questions or comments that they would like to add into this presentation, now is the time. You can unmute yourself and go for it.
I have a question. What do you do when someone gets triggered and they just go, nah, can't do this anymore? Like, what's the damage control there?
So I can give a response for what I do, but I would also defer to people with more experience to answer as well. I mean, what I tend to emphasize is there's nothing in this class that you have to do. So you can decide not to do something. And that is completely within not only your rights, but, you know, I'm encouraging it because this is about boundary setting, right? So if you want to step out at any point, I tend to teach on my own, so I don't have an assistant, which means it can get a little tricky if somebody does get triggered, but usually it's kind of like, you know, feel free to go and sit down. And I think Claire talked about this, like whenever it was last month, saying, you know, go ahead and sit down, do what you need to do. Just if you need to leave the room, let me know so I know you're okay. And if you feel like you need to leave the class, let me know about that as well so I know that you're okay. And then also saying like, do you want somebody to come and sit with you, and like dispatching someone to do that if the person says yes. Does anyone else have responses for how they handle if somebody is triggered? Yeah, Matt?
Yeah, we keep bags of ice, a whole cooler of just pre-bagged ice, so that if somebody starts getting triggered or going back into some other memory, have them hold a bag of ice on their wrists, chest, on the back of their neck. It helps bring them back into their bodies in this particular moment. And then if it gets a bit more severe, so that that's not helping enough, then we, you know, right there, just asking them to, you know, what do you notice in the room? To show, you know, what's orange? What's going on with, you know, how many toes do I have right now? Making them look and bringing their prefrontal cortex back online. It tends to help get them back in the moment. And then, of course, if they need to sit out or whatnot, then that as well. But the ice works 90% of the time.
Great. I hadn't heard that one before. That's excellent. Very good.
I could weigh in on something that I do for my classes if we've got some time. I generally work by myself, so I can't often step away from an activity to work with somebody who's been triggered. And what I'll generally do is I will stop the activity and then engage everybody as a group in a breathing exercise or some sort of tapping exercise that I teach them is something that they can do if they feel like that they're getting over engaged or feeling triggered. And it gives the class or the person not only the opportunity to take up the space that they need to have that moment, but it gives the class the opportunity to support that person as a group rather than having them feel isolated. And then I usually will reiterate to everybody that, you know, this is voluntary. You don't need to continue this if you don't want to, and give them the opportunity to step out if they want to at that time. That's all I had to say on that one.
That's great. Yeah, that's a really great suggestion as well. Antonella, the person who would be good to talk to about this as well would be Claire, because I think you were in Claire's webinar, right? Where she talked about trauma-informed training. Oh, yeah.
That's the one I stepped through in, yeah.
Well, but yeah, fair enough. I mean, if it's, about her being awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, but she's a good resource for that.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Matt, you had a question about resources for these games. So UDEED has her handbook, and I would say that she's really pretty major source person for ESD games. So if you can get a copy of the El Halev handbook, it has loads of descriptions of games. Yeah, Anne?
I was just thinking too that like I try and be conscious of how adrenalizing the activities that I'm using are. And at least in my classes, I think I sort of start from a lower level of activation and work my way up, like not, and that way I kind of like see if people are, I don't know, there's a little bit of, I guess, more predictability. So I'm not like, I don't hit with noodles right away, let's put it that way. Like, I'm starting at a lower level of activation. In fact, we don't like hit with noodles at all, but we do end up like, hitting pads and, but I say that for the end. And if I have a long enough workshop, even in a 3-hour workshop, I can get in some ground fighting and reversals. And that's also towards the end. So I don't tend to start people off with like the most intense thing that I'm doing. So I guess that's helped me, although you never know what's going to be intense for somebody, but that's helped me to like not have as many, people feeling like they are triggered or can't participate, because I'm like I'm fooling them into doing it towards the end. So.
Yeah, and I think that there is something about some of those game structures that work in that same way, that you're kind of leading someone in. The insight, or leading them toward the skill development, so that by the time they reach it, they haven't quite realized that that's what they're doing until that moment. And so it's because sometimes what happens with the triggering is this like thing of, oh my God, I'm going to have to be in that situation where I have to have somebody, grab me from behind, or, put their hands on my throat or whatever. And it being like a thing about having the boundaries like almost re-violated in the training. Sometimes it's that. And so it can be nice if there's this other way, if it sometimes the thing with the game is that it approaches the skill sidelong rather than kind of doing it head on, which can sometimes be helpful. All right, well, it's 10:05, so we're pretty much coming to an end, and it sounds like people don't have a huge amount of questions. I think there's a question about the online resources, and then Nancy, thank you for your question about a place to review my book. I would love it if you did review it. Will I be able to keep the chat open for a little bit after we formally conclude, Beth?
Yeah, we can actually formally conclude, and then I won't end the meeting, and then you can add stuff into the chat after.
Perfect.
That.
Okay.
So why don't we, if there's any like last burning question that needs to be asked, now's the time.
Yeah, I have a question. Hasn't happened yet, so it's a hypothetical. I'm not sure if it's even realistic. What happens if you have an individual who is playing games, and all of a sudden they actually act out the bully, they act out the sinister person, and they just get a little bit too full on, and you need to just rein them back?
So I haven't had exactly that kind of thing happen, but I have had, I ended up doing this thing where I was teaching an ESD workshop for a bunch of it was in Britain. It was a sports studies class, and it was a bunch of young, primarily white, primarily heterosexual men. So they were really this demographic who kind of thought of themselves as not needing ESD training. And it was really weird that I just happened to be teaching this. And it had to do with like a programmatic thing, and with the director thinking it would be a good idea for them to see what this thing is. And so there was a lot of them, to use a bit of a Britishism, messing about in the beginning, like doing stuff with the focus myths that were not what I was telling them. And so in that situation, I had to move out of the prankster role a little bit and just be like, all right, I need you to stick to the drill, right? I know you do other things in this class, but this is what I'm asking you to do right now. And in that situation, I moved very quickly to talking about eye strikes and groin strikes. And that shut them up right away. Like they were just like, oh, oh, like this. And so in that situation, it was like the joking thing kind of got across maybe a little bit of the initially wrong impression of, well, this is something it's self-defense for people who maybe aren't really capable of inflicting real damage, or maybe even this is being taught by somebody who doesn't have the skill set. So I moved right to that, and then I moved right to ground fighting and moving on the ground. And they realized, wait, there is actually like a pretty serious like skill set here that's needed, and there is also like this is also self-defense. It's about doing harm. So I think that sort of like using the play structure as not just a kind of like play is kind and benevolent, but play also it has the element of trickery to it as well. And sometimes maybe that's necessary in a certain situation to kind of create the space where one can deal with potential conflict without having to address it headlong and just say like, hey, stop it. I don't like how you're behaving in my class. And because then it starts to get into an antagonistic thing, which may be necessary, as we know, with boundary setting. Sometimes we need to do that. But sometimes we also can be interesting to work these other kinds of positions, right? Just like we do in real life with boundary setting. Sometimes you got to say like, hey, back up, leave me alone. But sometimes it's okay to be like, yeah, hey, sorry, I am a jerk. Yeah. You know, and kind of play with that sort of deflection or stepping off the center kind of thing. So those are my suggestions, but if other people have suggestions, you can feel free to weigh in.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions? No, I think we're good to go, Jay.
All right, well, great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time out to come and give this presentation today. This was wonderful.
Sure, thank you very much. Thank you for spending your Sunday afternoon or morning or middle of the night
yes.
talking about ESD and games.
This is where we find out how global we truly are.